we've got a lot to get into. And I normally, our listeners know who you are, so I'm just going to go ahead and blast off. I'm not even going to give you time to talk because there's a lot going on. We've got Congress, and I'm just going to give you what I know, and you can tell me how correct or incorrect I am. We've got Congress who has passed or not passed a law, excuse me, or yeah, they didn't. They voted against the rail unions and said you need to get to work. Now I'm thinking, so far, how am I doing? Am I doing well? Okay, cool. I'm going to keep going. So they voted it down and as a Band-Aid. Now, what a lot of people don't realize, and I have experience in the shipping industry in a past life. This is the busiest time of year. This is Q4. This is Christmas. We live in a consumer economy. So for them to strike now, and it's oftentimes a lot cheaper to move things intermodal via intermodal, which is another fancy way of saying over the rail, right? Like it's a lot cheaper for shippers to move things over the rail. Them striking right now would fuck everything up. Like it would be so bad. Everything would have to go over the road. And when that happens, then you would, and there's certain shipments that have to get places immediately. Then you're gonna need to employ teams. That's more expensive, which are 2 drivers. So no one wants this to happen, right? So you put a Band-Aid on it. The rail workers are not happy about this. So where does that leave us now? That's the $1 billion question in the room right now. And that's a lot. And I did well?
Yeah. So Congress imposed a contract deal. And there is certain mechanisms that the federal government and the rail companies work with. There's a special arbitration board, there's a special mediation board, there's a special presidential emergency committee. All of these mechanisms are in place. This is not the first time this has happened. Do you know how many times this has happened in U.S. history?
You know, I don't. I'm very curious to know.
18 times since 1926.
Damn.
So I guess to go to where we are today, if I may, I would like to go back to the 1800s.
Oh, hell yeah. I love history. Let's go.
So in the 1800s and in the mid 1800s, labor organizing was essentially illegal. Not only did the United States have outright slavery, there was other forms of ways of keeping everyone down. In the mid to late 1800s, there were criminal cases against workers who had quote unquote conspiracy to raise their wages through actions that today we know as like labor organizing. Now, in 1877, there was the Great Railroad Strike. Now, in this 1877 Great Railroad Strike, about 100,000 workers were involved. Through a combination of unofficial, boss-led, company-led militias, federal troops, the National Guard, they attacked workers with over 1,000 arrests and 100 deaths. And industry continued to cut wages and break unions. This one lasting impact of this that we'll see up till today is the National Guard, local militias, and the government saying, holy shit, we don't have enough control over our infrastructure. Workers can really strike and upend our entire society if they're not getting fair payment. So instead of fair payment, what is the answer is, right, more laws, more militia, more National Guard. After 1877, there began to be more armories and more surveillance in working class areas, and in particular around key infrastructure, because this strike in 1877, that was ad hoc, that was random, that was a little unsuccessful, but did have 100,000 workers in the population, a lot smaller back then, had demonstrated the power of what national labor organizing could be. And this was when there was no national railroad union at all, only railroad brotherhoods and sort of job-specific craft organizations. And after this, about 10 years later, you see the Arbitration Act with some panels and some non-binding sort of work in the 1898 Erdman Act. But folks about 20 years later said, okay, well, we know what we have the power to do. There's the 1894 Pullman strike. And in 1894, this was 250,000 workers. A lot of this was the Pullman factory, which at the time you've heard of company towns. Pullman not only manufactured rail cars, but they also were the landlords for workers. Pullman was treating a small number of workers compared to that 250,000 very unfairly. But you know what? Across the entire industry, people were like, you know what? Because of what they're doing to the workers in Pullman, we're not going to load the cars. And the other people said, you know, well, we're not going to drive the cars. We're going to keep these trains grounded. The entire industry came to a halt. 1894 Pullman strike is huge. Federal troops, again, ended the strike by force. There were some concessions. Workers got a little bit more. Eugene Debs, who would later run for president, an out socialist, was imprisoned due to the 1894 Pullman strike. In 1916, less than 20 years later, there was the talk of an incredible, even bigger strike threat of 94% of rail workers. You know what we got out of that? The 8-hour day and in the groundwork for minimum wage laws, the Adamson Act of 1916. But things were still not fair. I mean, as you know it, people are working fucking hard out there. So in 1922, after World War I, and people sacrificed a lot, went to war, died, worked long hours to support the war effort, there was another huge rail strike in 1922 with militias and federal and National Guard troops on one side, huge scab efforts, a giant strike. After it ended, the capitalist class, the powers that be, said we must have the Railway Labor Act of 1926, which has been used 18 times, including by President Biden, to stop and withhold the potential of a strike. They said, you know what? Workers are getting too much. They're in control of too much. How can we control them? Quote unquote labor law comes into effect. So this has been amended in the 30s and later to include airlines too. So the airlines cannot just stop. You do not have the freedom to do that. So there's labor law, then there's labor freedom. Under labor law, these rail workers do not have the legal ability to stop working, which is, I think, way more criminal than if they did start working. So this isn't even the end, because we've got it 1945 to 1946. What would you say if I told you about 1 in 10 or more, depending on how we cut the numbers, working Americans were on strike in 1945 to 1946?
I would be shocked.
It is so untalked about, and it's interesting what histories are hidden from us. Nearly 5 million people struck from 1945 to 1946. Major nationwide rail strikes started with 800,000 steel workers going off the job, ripple effects, solidarity strikes, secondary strikes, rail negotiations faltered. Do you know what President Truman tried to do to stop this strike?
What did he try to do? I don't know.
He tried to draft the workers. There was a law put into Congress that sought to say, what if we just drafted all of these rail workers, these 800,000 workers, made them federal armed forces, and then they have to, under threat of treason or sedition, go back to work. That was a legitimate policy proposal that went forward.
It's so crazy.
It is absolutely bonkers. And this is what happened in 1945, 1946. And guess what happened after this unfathomably large took Congress, the government, and the military to stop this post-World War II strike where people said, enough is enough. We demand fair wages and rest and days off work, which Biden is not letting them have. We got what is called sometimes the Wagner Act, sometimes called the National Labor Relations Act. The framework from which all labor unions operate today came in 1947 on the heels of 5 million people, the closest thing to a general strike in American history. How many rail strikes have we had since 1947?
12. I don't
One.
know.
One. In 1992, 2 days afterwards, Congress used their power to stop it. It was incredibly minor. 92 Clinton era. I'm not sure if it was Clinton or outgoing W or Big Bush on the way out. But just the interconnectedness of one company out of today, I believe there's 12 major companies that make up the railway system. 12 freight rail unions, but a smaller number of employers. Just one of them struck. And it was enough that in 2 days, the federal government said, not even one small part of the railway system may strike. So all that to say, what happened under President Biden is actually not that unusual. And it is terrible. It would be terrible for them to strike right now. But how even more terrible is it for people to work and have to notify 30 days in advance if you need to take a medical day off, unpaid? Do you know when you're going to be sick 30 days from now if you sprain your ankle?
No, not at all.
No. So I think it would be terrible for the U.S. economy if there was a big strike and corporate owned and institutionally friendly media made a good deal about that. And it would be terrible. But these workers, a third of which have lost their jobs over the past 6 years due to precision scheduled railroading, pioneered in 2016. 0 paid days off, 0 paid sick days off is terrible. So there's some money in this contract that the federal government pushed forward using the powers that they have, but it's not enough to give people what they need, which is rest, balance, time off, the ability to celebrate the birthday of a loved one, be with your kid if they're sick. So I think that's what happened is actually a continuation of a 100-year history, over 100-year history of the suppression of farm workers, agricultural workers writ large, rail workers and infrastructure workers who, without production and consumption runs to a halt. And the most important thing, the dollar bill starts to slip.
Yeah, I was.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Yeah, that was honestly beautifully put. Very impassioned. Loved it. Did not know any of this history, which is fascinating to me. I'm way too pigeonholed into like a military history and combat and all that stuff. So it's good to I know all about the Battle of Blair Mountain, right, which is a coal miners' strike, which is insane. But I didn't know about the rail workers. So thank you so much for sharing that with me and my audience. I find it interesting though. So we have pays on the table. Paid sick time, right? They're trying to get 7 paid sick days, and let's see, we talked about pay, and then I don't know if like a vacation was in there. Like, kind of, if you could kind of let everyone know what their demands are.
Yeah, I believe you kind of covered it. Is sick 7 sick days off is kind of really part of the core. A statement by Railroad Workers United say that they find it despicable but not surprising that both parties opted to side with big business over working people last week and vote against the interest of rail workers not once but twice within hours, suffered a 1-2 punch at the hands of first the Democratic Party, second served up by the Republicans. It is straightforward. Union Pacific and BNSF Railway are using attendance policies that really just punish workers for taking any time off the job. Engineers and conductors face penalties for taking time off, including in the labor dispute, weekends, outside of holidays, and pre-planned vacations, even in the case of emergency. Really, this attendance policy and being on call and just a few hours notice before taking on shift is not that dissimilar to what happens in hospitals. Yeah. So weekends and emergencies basically being 365, 24/7 on call with only a few hours notice to take shift, combined with tightening schedules and stiff punishments under this super sort of lean operation that has reduced a third of the jobs since 2016, makes their jobs more unsafe, more demanding, at the same time, more and more on call to try to maximize efficiency.
Oh, yeah.
And this puts strains on finances, families, and health. And that has to be balanced with the fact that BNSF has a net income of nearly $6 billion in 2021, up 16% from the previous year, says the New York Times. Union Pacific likewise has a net income of $6.5 billion, up 16% since 2020. Granted, the pandemic happened, but there is money there to hire enough people to give you 7 days off a year. Other freight companies, CSX Transportation and Norfolk Southern Railway, have also posted large gains. But 12 unions altogether are demanding a better workplace. In this particular strike threat was from just 4 of the 12, representing just over half of 115,000 rail workers covered by the deal. These 4 unions had voted down the deal, citing the main concern on top of all of this: just give us sick days. Let me catch the flu and stay home and not lose my job, or come into my job and get everyone sick and endanger not only us, but our performance in keeping everything safe. So those are the major demands.